The situation in Iran is fast moving, and the fact that it is fast moving is a puzzle itself. But what we are observing right now is the convergence of every possible credible commitment problem that you could imagine. So it is worth spending a few minutes to work through all of the layers. Because once we understand what is happening with the tactical situation, Iran's harsh crackdown seems to make more strategic sense, even if it is liable to backfire. To catch up on the current situation, massive anti-regime protests still appear to be raging across the country, though we are actually observing fewer of them because internet access has been cut off, and so our open source intelligence has fallen off a cliff. The Trump administration warned the Islamic Republic not to execute any prisoners, never mind to scale back repression efforts on the streets. Trump, at least publicly, has suggested that he is okay with Iran's current posture, though hold on to your skepticism about that for later in the video. Indeed, simultaneously, the United States has begun pulling back some troops at a nearby base in Qatar. That leaves the United States in a worse position overall in the region, so it is only the type of thing that you would do if you wanted to protect those soldiers from Iranian retaliation, or are willing to pay the cost associated with a bluff. Either way, we are currently in the doing category here, not the saying category. Iran seems to agree with that assessment. Yesterday, it briefly closed its airspace. That is something that you do to facilitate the shooting down of enemy aircraft. If your airspace is closed, but you see something on your radar anyway, then you know it is hostile. The one major hiccup here is that the United States still has no aircraft carriers in the region. The closest one, the USS Abraham Lincoln, is hanging out in the South China Sea right now. Even if Mr. Lincoln absolutely books it over to the Strait of Hormuz, it remains at least a few days away. Also of note is that there are no indications that it has started heading west. Now, I mentioned this the last time that we talked about Iran, but you would probably want two carriers in the region if you were being serious about an expansive Iran operation. So that leaves us with the question of what you can do given what is there. There are a bunch of bases in the region, so it is not like the United States is helpless. But let's talk a bit about what you might try to do with a relatively light footprint. Oh, and I will assume that the United States is going it alone here. Obviously, Israel is somewhat nearby and has shown a recent predilection for bombing Iran. However, I am not sure about the optics of an Israeli intervention. The Ayatollah is almost past the point of a rally round the flag effect. But I have no doubt that any Israeli participation would receive wall-to-wall coverage in Iran, and it would undoubtedly color the perceptions of the relative moderates in the country. Yes, crazier things have happened than an Israeli action here, especially if Iran tries to bait it by striking Israel first. But there are only so many things that I can cover at once. I am at 14 videos in 15 days at this point. Yikes, 2026. Anyway, as a point of comparison, let's go back to Operation Midnight Hammer from last June. These were the strikes on Iran's nuclear program, and there are two big differences between then and now. One is that Iran's nuclear program was concentrated, and thus the United States could get good value by only hitting 3 sites. The second is that the United States appear to have more naval assets in the region than is currently the case, though no carriers were used in that operation, and it is hard to get intelligence on the current location of every U.S. vessel. So let's imagine that the second constraint is binding, and that the United States does not have more assets in the region than what is publicly known. What can the Stars and Stripes do in this situation? Well, the answer is not much. We are looking at highly decentralized protests around the country, and security forces deployed everywhere to counteract them. With unlimited resources, you might try striking the local logistics of security forces near every major city. Bear in mind, that is a challenge in itself, because you would essentially be aiming at police precincts, or trying to disrupt deployments of security forces to particular hotspots. Think disrupting transportation infrastructure here. Also, as far as we know, security forces have not switched allegiances in any of the major cities. Once that happens, you could try to make one of those cities a rebel stronghold, from which to mount a more traditional civil war. But whether that has happened or not, neither strategy I just described is possible if the US has fewer assets than what was used in Midnight Hammer. What is left as an option is basically to go for a decapitation strike. This does not necessarily mean assassinating the Ayatollah. Rather, you might target Iran's Ministry of Defense and Arms Forces Logistics. That is its full name, by the way, and it is apt for the situation. Alternatively, you could target the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Traditionally, US presidents have avoided targeting specific individuals in that manner. But Trump is not a traditional president. Indeed, he ordered the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, a high-ranking official in the IRGC, back in 2020. Notably, this was done with a Reaper drone, and I think it is worth further noting that the distance between Kuwait and Tehran is 400 miles. Reapers have a range of 1,100 miles. You do the math, but you're starting to get a picture of what sorts of options are actually there right now. Nonetheless, any decapitation strike would be a high-variance strategy. The United States would hope that institutional chaos erupts in the aftermath, as either internal fighting over succession in those roles distracts from the crackdown efforts, or security forces decide to pull back in the absence of having clear orders. Or word spreads among the protesters that they have international support, propelling them to stay on the streets and increase their numbers. And also pray that the international support does not suddenly evaporate, as was the case with uprisings in Iraq after the Persian Gulf War. For Trump, a man who campaigned on keeping the United States out of foreign entanglements, such a strategy would look attractive. After striking Houthis in Yemen, and after striking Iran's nuclear program, and after the special extraction operation in Venezuela, he has proven that he has a willingness to take adventurous foreign policy actions, so long as they do not require a sustained and dangerous commitment. But how effective that strategy will be remains in question. And that takes us to the abundance of commitment problems nested in the situation that we are observing right now. A commitment problem arises when one party would like to promise to behave cooperatively in the future, but once that future arrives, that party no longer has incentive to follow through. That forces an opposing party to take an inefficient action in the present. Think of it as a coercive window that is closing. If you do not jump through it now, you will never have the chance later. I would abbreviate credible commitment problem to CCP, but CCP conjures up images of something entirely different, so let's avoid that issue. Anyway, the base layer of the current credible commitment problem is the protest movement itself. The protesters have resolved their collective action problem, giving them newfound coercive power against their government. In response to that, the government would like to reach a deal commensurate with that balance of power, essentially conceding on the issues most important to the protesters, so that the regime may survive. However, once the protesters go home, their coercive power evaporates, and the government can renege on those concessions. Of course, the protesters can anticipate this incentive, which is why they push for regime change. That is the only way to guarantee the reforms over the long term. The protesters may also be considering the signals that they have observed from abroad. In past years, if things got this bad, it was conceivable that Russia might provide assistance to the government, as we have seen in Belarus and Kazakhstan. But then Russia had to bog itself down in Ukraine, allowing Syrian rebels to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. Oh, and Azerbaijan ignored a Russia-enforced peace deal with Armenia. And in the middle of the Iranian protests, the United States arrested Nicolas Maduro. Of course, the Kremlin will not be distracted in Ukraine forever, so that added to the incentive to put pressure on the Iranian government now, and then further escalate upon observing the Venezuela situation. Central to the commitment problem logic here, the people of Iran cannot believe any promises from the government to maintain institutional reforms once Russia returns to its enforcement role. Then there is the added layer of credible commitment complications that come with a possible US intervention. We can say with relative confidence that the government crackdown has been harsh. Estimates on the number of deaths range between 2,500 and 12,000. Now, autocratic responses to protests naturally vary, and it is not out of the realm of plausibility that this is just what the Ayatollah calculated would be the best domestic response to the situation. However, oftentimes autocrats prefer to let the protests play out, hoping that the people on the streets will eventually get bored and just go home. No need to incite a backlash effect by taking lethal and widespread countermeasures. This is where the current U.S. position might matter. An intervention can only be effective if the protests are still happening. Well, imagine that you are sitting in Tehran right now, looking at the military situation, and realizing that the United States lacks the assets to do something serious. Nonetheless, if these protests last for another month or so, the United States will be able to put together the puzzle pieces and significantly reduce your ability to survive the uprising. Well, then perhaps your best strategy is to roll the dice, initiate harsh crackdown measures, and hope to resolve the situation before the United States can intervene. The United States might complain about the loss of life and try to negotiate with you to lay off the protesters. But the United States cannot credibly commit to hold back a military buildup in the region. Consequently, you are still maximizing your chances of survival, even if it does inflame the rhetoric coming out of Washington. For now, though, we sit back and wait to see whether the protests will end before Trump gives the order, assuming he is planning to give an order at all. That is just the problem with the situation for us as observers. We do not have as good of a grasp on the intelligence situation. It is possible that all signs point to no. Us folks on our keyboards remain clueless about the situation, and all of this media hype is for nothing. But as we wait, if you want to catch up on what is happening in the Middle East, check out this playlist that I have on the subject. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.